Request 2, Introduction to Request with ES6. In the previous lesson, we spent a lot of time dealing with asynchronous data. Remember AJAX, asynchronous JavaScript, and XML? Many of our web page interactions rely on asynchronous events, so managing these events is essential to good web development. To make asynchronous event handling easier, promises were introduced in JavaScript in ES6. Mozilla Development Network Promises, a link. A promise is an object that handles asynchronous data. A promise has 3 states. Pending, when a promise is created or waiting for data. Fulfilled, the asynchronous operation was handled successfully. Rejected, the asynchronous operation was unsuccessful. The great thing about promises is that once a promise is fulfilled or rejected, you can chain an additional method to the original promise. In this lesson, we will explain how to use fetch, which uses promises to handle requests. Then we will simplify request using async and await. We'll use the Datamuse API for GET request and Rebrandly URL shortener API for POST requests. For you to complete the lesson on POST, make sure you create a Rebrandly API key by following the instructions in the article below. And we did that last time. I'll make myself another one for this one, but you should know how to do it, and there are directions in this article. Instructions. Click the button on the web page to see what the code in main.js does. Notice the usage of fetch, async, and await. Okay, that's this. We have an ID coming back. This looks to be a user of our website, maybe. They have a name, username, and so on. We'll also be working with JSON, so study the structure of the response on the web page. Go to the next exercise to learn more about requests. Let's go to the next one. Fetch, get request 1. The first type of request we're going to tackle are GET requests using fetch, MDN fetch API. The fetch function creates a request object that contains relevant information that an API needs, sends that request object to the API endpoint provided, returns a promise that ultimately resolves to a response object, which contains the status of the promise with information the API sent back. In the next exercise, we'll go over the boilerplate code for using fetch and walk through what each step does, instructions. Move on to the next exercise when you're ready. Here's a fetch get, it's fetch, and then we invoke it, and inside the invocation, we put in the web address we're going to, .then, and then they're calling a response. I'm sure you could call this anything you want. And there it says if response.ok, return response.json. Otherwise, throw a new error, request failed. And then we commaed after that, network error, and that is the error. And then .json response, more code to execute right there. Let's see this slowly in the next one. Fetch, get request 2. We are going to reconstruct the boilerplate code necessary to create a GET request using the fetch function step by step. Feel free to refer to the fetch get diagram at any point while completing this exercise. Fetch get diagram. Instructions. 1. First call the fetch function and pass it the URL as a string. So fetch, we'll open it up. Here is the URL. And we need to make it a string. Great. The first argument determines the endpoint of the request. And now we'll press run. Number 2. Chain a .then method to the end of the fetch function and pass it the success callback arrow function as its first argument. The success callback function takes one parameter, response. Okay, we'll chain a .then here, so .then, and it wants us to have one parameter called response. And we'll just add the body there. .then will fire only after the promise status of fetch has been resolved. Let's see if we did that right, see if they want it that way. Yep, that's perfect. Number 3, inside of the response callback function, check the OK property of response inside of a conditional statement. In the code block of the conditional statement, return response.json. Okay, so here we're going to say we want an if statement. If response dot, it said okay, okay. And you could set this equal to true, but true is a falsy value, a truthy value when we're talking truthy falsy. So if this exists, it will run this part of the code if there is an okay. But we will just for this triple equal it to true as well. And we'll just return response.json and invoke that. Let's see if that's all right. That's working. Number 4. Below the curly braces of the conditional statement, create a new error with this code. Throw new error, request failed. Your code will throw this error when response.ok is falsy. So right after this part, we want to throw new error, request failed. Let's try that out. There we go. Number 5, add a second argument to .then. It will be an arrow function that will handle our failures. Separate the first callback function from the second with a comma. The second callback function takes a parameter network error. So we're saying within this .then, we want to add a second, not response here, but network error. So that would be outside of this, but inside of this. So let's comma to that. We're going to call it network error and point to an empty function for right now. In the code block of the second callback function, log network error.message. So console.log a network error.message. If we could not reach the endpoint at all because maybe the server is down, then we would get this network error. Let's run that and see if this is done properly. That's right. Okay, great. Let's go to number 6. Chain another .then method to the end of the first .then method. Pass the new .then method a callback function that takes JSON response as its parameter and return JSON response. So now we're going to .then after this .then. So here, right at the end, we will .then open up, and it's going to be called JSON response. And we want to return JSON response. And let's run that. Great, we can move on to the next lesson. Fetch get request 3. In the previous exercise, you wrote the boilerplate code for a get request using fetch and .then. In this exercise, you're going to use that code and manipulate it to access the Datamuse API and render information in the browser. Datamuse API. If the request is successful, you will get back an array of words that sound like the word you typed into the input field. You may get some errors as you complete each step. This is because sometimes we've split a single step into one or more steps to make it easier to follow. By the end, you should be receiving no errors. Instructions. Number 1. At the top of main.js, create a const called URL. Assign URL the following URL as a string. Okay, so that's going to be at the top. We'll make a const called URL. And as a string, that is assigned. Let's run that. Great. Number 2. Below URL, create another const and call it query params. Assign it a value of, and there's a question mark, SL equals. Query params will be the start of your query string and will narrow your search to words that sound like your word. Okay, so we will make a const called query params, and I'm just going to copy this here and get it right. Const query params, capital P, is going to equal this as a string. Perfect. Let's run that. That works. Number 3. Inside the getSuggestions function, create a const called word query and assign it input field.value. We got to find getSuggestions, and then we want a const called word query. Const word query equals input field dot value. You'll need word query to store the value of what's being typed into the input field. You will be working inside getSuggestions for the remainder of the exercise. So let's run that. Const word query. Did I do that wrong? Oh, yep, that's not the right letter. Perfect. Number 4. And now it's time to add a query string to the URL with all the necessary parameters. Create another const called endpoint. Assign it value of a string that is URL, query params, and word query concatenated in that order. Okay, so we'll make a const called endpoint, all undercase. That's going to equal string concatenation here. So let me put up my backticks real quick. The first one was endpoint. Oh no, we made the const endpoint there. So the first one is URL. Let's make another one. That is query params. And one more. That is word query. And let's see how that goes. Number 5. Call the fetch function and pass in endpoint as an argument. For this API to work within the provided browser, add cache, no cache as the second argument. So we should still be inside of here. So what we'll do is fetch. And inside of fetch, we want the URL as the first thing. And then our second argument was this right here. So this object, this must be like an options object here. So we have that set up. I think that's right. Let's run it. Oh, there's something wrong. Did you call fetch with endpoint? Oh, I put URL. We just made endpoint, and I'm using URL. All right, good. Let's see if that works. That is it. Okay, great. Number 6. Chain a .then method to the fetch function. Pass it a success arrow callback function as an argument. The callback function should take response as its single parameter. Okay, so we'll do a .then after our fetch. .then, and then we wanted response. And that should be our entire arrow callback function there. Let's see if that's working for us. Perfect. Number 7. Inside the success callback function, create a conditional statement that checks if the OK property of the response object evaluates to a truthy value. If so, call the function renderJSON_response and pass in response as an argument. Then run your code. Okay. That was a lot of words, so we're going to go through this a little slowly here. So we had the response. Now we need to check the OK value of the response. Okay, we did this last time. So this will be if response dot OK. And I'm not going to do the triple equals true here because this should work the way it is, and if it doesn't, we'll change it later. Now, if that's true, I want to let me copy this. Render JSON response, and I'm going to pass in the response. Then run your code. Okay, let me run it. Then type in a word and click the Submit button to view the JSON that came back. The status of the promise returned from fetch will be resolved. The code for render JSON response can be viewed at public/helper functions. That's right in your folder here if you want to take a look. So we'll enter a word. Last time we did enter. Let's do it again. Cool. And they have a type. They say cores. The URL is the API data muse. Redirect false. Status 200. OK is true. Status text is OK. Yeah, so when we wrote response.OK, what we're getting is true, which is a truthy value, which means this would mean true here. So if true, and if it did not come back OK, I imagine it would either be undefined or false. Let's move on to number 8. Delete render JSON response and replace it with return response.json, and then invoke the .json. Okay, we'll get rid of that and then return response.json and then invoke that. By returning response.json, the next function, that is .then chained to it, will receive a promise with JSON data. So let's run that, see if that's right. Good. Number 9. Below the conditions code block, add this code to raise an exception if the request failed. Throw new error, request failed. Okay, we will copy that, and that's after our if. We'll do a new error with request failed. Let's run that. Number 10. Separate the success callback function and the error callback function with a comma. The error callback function will also be an arrow function that takes one parameter, network error. In the code block of the arrow function, log network error.message to the console. And so now we'll separate, we have response here, and then we want our network error. So this would end here. That's not what we want. We want to, right before where it ends, comma, we'll write network error. And we'll do a fat arrow inside there. Log, so console.log network error.message. And let's run that, see if that's right. Perfect. And we can move on to the next lesson. Fetch get requests for. Great job making it this far. In the previous exercise, you created the query URL, called the fetch function, and passed it the query URL and a settings object. Then you chained a .then method and passed it 2 functions as arguments. One to handle the promise if it resolves, and one to handle network errors if the promise is rejected. In this exercise, you'll now take the information that was returned with the promise and manipulate the web page. Instructions. Number 1. At the end of the .then method, chain another .then method. Pass .then an anonymous arrow callback function that takes JSON response as its single parameter. Okay, let's find our first .then. That's you right here. And you open up right here. So here the .then is over. We'll chain another .then. And inside of there, we're taking JSON response. That's our parameter. And we will point to just in an empty body for right now and run that. That works. Number 2. Inside the callback function, call the function render raw response and pass in JSON response as an argument. Run the code. All right, inside of here, we're going to write render raw response. And inside of here, we're going to paste this right in, JSON response, and run the code. In the input field, you can type in a word and click the submit button. Okay, let's type in a word, enter, submit. If all went well, you should see an array of words that the DataMuse API responded with. You can view the purpose of render raw response at public/helperfunctions.js. Now we see that we have words, they have scores, numbers of syllables, and the words themselves. That's what's coming back in the JSON here. It's an array of objects. Number 3, time to clean up that response a bit. Delete render raw response and passed in JSON response and replace it with render response passed in JSON response. Run your code, try the web page again with another word. So we're just changing this, paste that in and run. And let's use that same word, enter. Here we are. We can see now we just have the words. Perfect. Let's go to the next lesson. Fetch post requests. 1. In the previous exercise, you successfully wrote a GET request using the Fetch API and handled promises to get word suggestions from data muse. Give yourself a pat on the back, or 2 to treat yourself. Now you're going to learn how to use Fetch to construct post requests. Take a look at the diagram to the right. It has the boilerplate code for a post request using Fetch. Notice that the initial call takes 2 arguments, an endpoint and an object that contains information needed for the post request. The rest of the request is identical to the GET request. So it's going to take 2 arguments right here. Under Fetch, we have our API there, what we're trying to hit, the method, which says post, and a body, json.stringify, some object that we pass in. So that's the big change here. Let's move on to the next lesson. Fetch post requests 2. We are going to reconstruct the code from the previous exercise step by step until we have written a complete post request using Fetch and .then. Feel free to refer to the fetch post diagram at any point while completing this exercise. Fetch post diagram. Instructions. Number 1. Call the fetch function. Pass it the URL below as a string as its first argument, and pass it an empty object as its second argument. All right, let's do this first. We had fetch. It wants the URL, and then we're going to comma to an empty object. So I'm going to grab this URL. It has to be a string, remember? We're calling fetch and providing an endpoint. In the next step, we'll fill in the empty object with the necessary information. Okay, let's run this. Number 2. The settings object you pass to the fetch function will contain 2 properties. Method with a value of post, and body with a value of json.stringify and object ID 200. The second argument determines that this request is a post request and what information will be sent to the API. Okay, so let's do that now. In here, we need 2 things. A method, that's going to be post as a string, and then we will comma to the body. And inside the body, we will have json.stringify. And inside that, we will make an object with ID, a string of 200. Let's see if that's all right there. We'll just run this. That's perfect. Number 3. Chain a .then method to the fetch function and pass it the success callback function as its first parameter. Pass in response as an argument for the callback function. Leave the code block of the callback function empty for now. Okay, I'm going to move this down. Hopefully this causes no problems for their compiler. Then, with this much on the screen, I'm going to increase the text just a little for you guys. I think that will be helpful. Maybe around there. This might be too big. Yeah, let's do it right here. In the .then. Okay, so we're going to pass in response. And we can leave the body empty for now. Let's run that. Okay, number 4. Inside the callback function's code block, check the OK property of the response object inside of a conditional statement. In the code block of the conditional statement, return response.json. When returned, this information will be passed on to the next .then callback function. Okay, so inside of here, we're going to return response.json and invoke that. Let's run that. Nope, I did that wrong. Oh, I didn't do the conditional yet. Okay, if response.ok, and we have to just wrap that return. That should do it. Let's run that. Okay. Number 5. Below the curly braces of the conditional statement, create a new error with this code. Throw new error request failed. Okay, so after the conditional is done, so right here, we will throw an error. This error will be raised if we get back some status error. Let's run that. Great. Number 6. Create the failure callback function. This function takes a single parameter, network error. Separate the first callback function from the second with a comma. This function is still inside of the .then method. In the code block of the function you just made, log network error.message to the console. Okay, so we have to comment to this, so that's the end of it, meaning that this closes the response block here. So we will comment now to network error. And let's do a function like so, and console.log, it was network error dot message. Let's run that. Perfect. Number 7. Chain another .then method to the end of the first .then method. In the new .then method, create an arrow callback function that takes JSON response as its parameter. Okay, let's do that first here. Now this is the end of the full .then here. So another .then. It's going to take in JSON response. Then in the code block, return JSON response. So return JSON response. The purpose of this step is to view the JSON that was returned from the previous .then. Let's run that. Looks good. We could go to the next lesson. If you don't have the Rebrandly API key, it's time to get it now. We could see this article right here. And go to the Rebrandly site. Log yourself in. Here I am logged in. I'm going to make myself a new API key. API keys. You don't have any API keys. Generate a new one. Now I'm copying my key and I'm back in. Okay, fetch, post request 3. In the previous exercise, you created the boilerplate code for making a post request using fetch and .then. In this exercise, you're going to update that boilerplate code to allow you to shorten a URL using the Rebrandly URL shortener API. They have a link to the Rebrandly API. If you haven't created a Rebrandly API key, that's what we just did. If you reset the exercise at any point, you will have to paste in your API key again at the top. Instructions. 1. Assign API key your Rebrandly API key as a string. If you do not assign the correct key, you will not see the proper results in the steps afterward. Okay, so right here, we're going to take this, get rid of it, and paste in that key that we just got. Do not use this key. I will delete it after this video. Just make your own key. Let's run that. There we go, number 2. Inside the code block of shorten URL, create a const named URL to shorten and assign it input field.value. URL to shorten will keep the value of what is being typed into the input field. Please note, you will be working inside shorten URL for the remainder of this exercise. So we're inside of here, the shorten URL. We need a const URL to shorten, assign it to input field dot value, and that should do it. Let's just run that. That's it, number 3. Underneath URL to shorten, create another const named data and assign it to the result of calling the method json.stringify with destination URL to shorten as an argument. All right, so we'll have our const data, and that will be equal to json.stringify. Open that up with this inside of it. I'm just copying the object into it. Okay, let's go ahead and run that. The reason for creating data is to prepare the information needed to send in the body. Number 4. Below data, call the fetch function, pass it URL as its first argument, and an empty object as its second argument. Okay, so under this, we're going to call fetch. The first argument is URL. The second argument is an empty object. And let's run that. Okay, number 5. Now it's time to add some properties to the empty object that you just created. Create a property with the key method and the value post as a string, all capitals. Okay, so we want a method of post as a string, all capital, and run. Number 6. In the same object, create another property. The key of this property is headers, and the value will be another object. Assign headers the value of another object listed below. Okay, so I'm going to copy this, but the key will be headers. So we will comma headers, and then we will paste that object as the headers. Let's run that. Great, number 7. In that same object that has the properties method and headers, add another property. The key is named body, and the value will be data. Okay, so inside of the method and headers, add another property. So after the object, that closes here, we will comma to yet another property, and we're going to call it body, and the value will be data. Okay, yeah, we made that data right up here with the JSON stringify, and that is the body that we're passing in. Setting up this information now will make chaining .then in the next exercise much easier. So let's run that and see if we did it right. We did. We can move on to the next exercise. Fetch post request 4. In the previous exercise, you've positioned yourself to make the post request by providing the endpoint and the object containing all the necessary information. In this exercise, you'll handle the response. The request returns a promise, which will either be resolved or rejected. If the promise resolves, you can use that information and the OK status. Let's implement that knowledge into your code. If you reset the exercise at any point, you will have to paste your API key again at the top. Instructions. Chain a .then method to the end of the fetch function you wrote in the previous exercise. As its first argument, pass it an arrow function as a callback that takes response as its single parameter. So after we do our fetch, which starts here and ends here, we write .then. We're going to have response, a fat arrow, and pointing to a body that is empty right now, and run that. Number 2. Inside the block of the function you made in step 1, use a conditional statement to check the value of the OK property of response. If it evaluates to a truthy value, call render JSON response and pass in response. Run the code. Okay, so we will do that if statement, if response.ok, then we do this. And in there we pass in response. Let's run that. Now, if you post a URL, you should see the object that was sent back. Render.json response is a helper function found in public/helper functions. Okay, let's go to number 3. Great, now that you see the raw response object, let me see. Did they give us anything to put in there? Let's shorten this URL. There we go. We ever type cores, or URL is now that, redirect false, and OK if true. That's what we need. So number 3. Great. Now that you see the raw object, you will need to pass the JSON to the next.then. Delete render.json response with response passed in, and replace it with return response.json invoked. So that's down here, and we want to get rid of it. Right, return response.json invoked. Run that. 4. Below the curly braces of the conditional statement, throw a new error in case response.ok is falsy. Okay. So after this, after the if, throw new error. And they wanted to say this inside of their request failed. We should be able to run that. Oh, I made a mistake. There we go. That should work. And that didn't work either. Let me just replace these quotes. Yeah, these quotes are weird ones, I guess. And run that. That's what I get for trying to save time by copying and pasting. Number 5. Outside of the code block from the first callback function you wrote, add another arrow callback function that takes network error as a single parameter. Console.log the network error.message inside of the callback function you just wrote. All right, so we're going to do that comma again. So after fetch, we're going to have our .then right here. So before that ends, we will comma, and we're passing network error in this anonymous function. So network error and console.log network error dot message. Let's see if we did that right. Great. We can go on to the next lesson. Fetch. Post request 5. You're almost done with the post request you started a few lessons back. In fact, this time you'll add another .then to the chain to finally make the information available to your web page. If you reset the exercise at any point, you will have to paste your API key again at the top. Instructions. 1. Chain a .then method to the end of the original .then method. That's all the way down. Where's our first .then? Right here. So right here, .then. And I guess that's it. Let's run that. That's it. Number 2. Pass in an anonymous arrow function as an argument for .then. This callback function will take JSON response as its single parameter. Okay, so in this .then, JSON response, and empty body right now. Inside the callback function, call render raw response and pass in JSON response. Okay, we'll copy that and pass in JSON response. And let's run that. Okay, put in any URL in the text field and then click the shorten button on the web page. Make sure you include the entire link, including the HTTP or HTTPS. So we should be able to copy this. It should give us the entire link. Yeah, it has that right there, so we can just click shorten And we get quite a bit of JSON here. Number of clicks, status active, is public, the shortened URL right here, and so on. Let's go to number 3. Delete render raw response JSON response. In its place, call render response and pass in JSON response. And then they want us to run the code again. So I'll just paste that over, run the code one more time, put a URL into the text field again, and then click the shorten button on the web page. Notice the difference. Here we go. Take U, paste here, and click shorten. Yep, and that's a big difference. That's just the URL without any more information there. The render response helper function can be viewed at public/helperfunctions.js. Let's move on to the next lesson. Async GET requests 1. Let's take a minute to appreciate what you've accomplished so far. Used fetch to make GET and POST request. Check the status of the response coming back. Catch errors that might possibly arise. Taking successful responses and rendering it on the web page. That is fantastic. It's the basis of how the internet works. In the following exercises, we're going to take what you've learned about chaining promises and make it simpler using functionality introduced in ES8, async and await. You read that right. You did the hard part already. Now it's time to make it easier. The structure for this request will also be slightly different. Notice the new keywords, async and await, as well as the try and catch statements. We'll be going over how to write the boilerplate code for async GET request in the next lesson. And here we see an async GET request. Async function get data. Now it has a try block inside of it and a catch block as well. So the function in the try block has a const and response is equaling await the fetch call. If the response is okay, so if that returns true, const JSON response equals await response.json, and then after that we'll execute some code with the JSON response. Under that, throw new error request failed, we have a catch for error, and it will console.log the error. Let's go to the next lesson. Async GET request 2. We are going to walk through and recreate the boilerplate code necessary to create a GET request using the async and await. Here are some of the key points to keep in mind as we walk through the code. Using an async function that will return a promise. Await can only be used in an async function. Await allows a program to run while waiting for a promise to resolve. In a try-catch statement, code in the try block will be run, and in the event of an exception/error, the code in the catch statement will be run. Feel free to refer to the async await get diagram at any point while completing this exercise. Async/await get diagram. Instructions. 1. In main.js, create an arrow function using the async keyword and save it to a const getData. The async keyword will ensure that the function returns a promise. Check the hint for syntax help. Okay, so an arrow function like this will be const get data and async before the arguments passed in, and then we'll pass our arrow, and that should do it. Let's go ahead and run that. Cool. Number 2. In the code block for getData, we should add a try statement with an empty code block. Okay, let's do that. Try, empty code block. Below the tried statement's code block, add a catch error statement. Okay, so under this one, catch error, and then the block there. The code in the try block will send a request and handle the response. The catch statement will then take care of an error if it's thrown. Check the hint for syntax help. Let's run that and see if it's right. Perfect. Number 3. Inside the catch code block, log error to the console. Since this exercise is an example, we're using console.log to view the error. Generally, developers create a more sophisticated way of handling the error, like redirecting their users to another page, but logging is fine for us at this moment. Inside the code block, they want us to log the error, so console.log error. Let's run that. Perfect. Number 4. Now we have to consider what to do inside of the code block of the try statement. We should start by using the await keyword before calling fetch. Pass in the following URL as a string to the function as its first argument. All right, so inside of try, we are going to await fetch, and this is its first argument as a string. We'll have to save the returned promise in a variable called response using the const keyword. Response will save the responsive endpoint once that information has been sent back. Check the hint for the syntax. Let's make that variable, so we want a const response to be equal to awaiting that fetch call. Let's run that. Great. Number 5. Under response, create a conditional statement that checks if the OK property of the response object evaluates to a truthy value. Under response, we would say if response.OK and open up our block. Let's run that. Number 6. Inside the code block of the conditional statement, await the resolution of calling the .json method on response. Save the returned object to a variable called JSON response using the keyword const. Okay, so in here, const JSON response equals await response .json invoked. Let's try that out. Oh, I didn't read this last piece here, sorry. Since .json is an asynchronous method, we have to await until the promise status is resolved. Then we store the value to know what data the JSON holds. And we ran it, it worked. Number 7. Return JSON response directly below the code you wrote in the previous step. All right, directly below this, return JSON response. Normally, we'd want to use the information from JSON response in a different manner. In this exercise, we're practicing how to write the boilerplate code. Let's run that. Perfect. Number 8. Below the conditional statement, throw a new error. The message the error should raise is request failed. So after the if, throw new error, and inside of there is request failed. An exclamation point. And failed is not capital. Okay, let's run that. Perfect. Let's go to the next lesson. Async GET request 3. In the previous exercise, we created the boilerplate code for making a GET request using async and await. In this exercise, you're going to build on previously created boilerplate code to get nouns that describe the inputted word from the DataMuse API. DataMuse API documentation. Instructions. 1. Under the comment AJAX function, create a new arrow function called getSuggestions using the async keyword. You'll be coding inside the arrow function of const getSuggestions for the remainder of this exercise. AJAX function code goes here. Now that's a const called getSuggestions, and that's an async arrow function. Let's run that. Cool. Number 2. Inside the code block of the async arrow function, create a const variable named word query and assign it input field .value. Okay, so inside of here, we're going to make a const called word query equal to input field .value. Let's run that. Number 3, create another const called endpoints. Assign it value of a string that is URL, query params, and word query concatenated in that order. Okay, so we'll make another const. Endpoint. That will equal, we'll do some concatenation, so I have my backticks. And the first thing is URL. The second one is query params. And the third one, word query. Let's run that. Number 4, add a try statement with an empty code block. Outside the code block for try, add a catch error statement with a code block that logs error to the console. Okay, so we need a try statement with an empty code block. Try, there's our empty code block. Now we'll have a catch. It will take an error, and it will console.log the error. All right, let's give that a run. Number 5. Inside the try code block, using const, create a variable named response and assign it to await the result of calling fetch with endpoint as the first argument. Okay, let's do that first. We have a const response equals fetch, and the first argument is endpoint. For this API to work within the provided browser, add cache, no cache as the second argument. And I will just copy that one in right after the endpoint, comma, to that. Let's run that. Nope, I must have done that wrong. We had a const response equal, oh, I didn't write await. Await fetch. Perfect. Okay, let's run that. There we go. Number 6. Below the variable response from the previous step, create a conditional statement that checks if the OK property of the response evaluates to a truthy value. Okay, let's do that. So right here, after we passed all that in, we're going to go to if response.ok. Inside the code block of the conditional statement, await response.json and save it to a variable called JSON response using the const keyword. Okay, so let's do that now. That's right here. Const JSON response equals await response.json and invoke it. I'm trying to just get that on one line for us. That's what we're doing right here. And run that. Great, let's go to number 7. Call the function render raw response and pass in JSON response, then run the code. Okay, render raw response. That will be right under here. And we'll pass in JSON response. And we'll run the code. In the response field, type in a word and click the submit button on the web page. You should now see an array of objects that contain nouns that describe the word you typed in. You can view the purpose of the render raw response helper function at public/helperfunctions.js. So here we need to enter a word, and we've been using enter, submit, and we see the same thing we saw last time. It's an array of objects. Number 8. Now that you can see the body of response, you should clean it up to display on the web page. Delete render raw response JSON response and replace it with render response JSON response and run the code. Then type another word and click submit. So we'll just paste that in there, run the code. We will type in enter again. We will click submit. And there we are. Now it's kind of in order. Great, now you have an organized list of words and you finish your GET request. You can view the purpose of render response function at public/helper functions. Let's move on to the next lesson. Async post request 1. Now that you've made an async get request, let's start on getting you familiar with async post requests. As with the other get and post requests that you've been making, an async post request requires more information. Take a look at the diagram. We still have the same structure of using try and catch as before, but in the fetch call, we now have to include an additional argument that contains more information like method and body. We'll be explaining the whys and hows of the boilerplate code for async post request in the next lesson. So it is exactly the same, except it seems that we are putting a method and a body. So that's the big change, is the same thing we did last time when we did this without async await. We added a method and a body to the fetch call. Let's go to the next lesson. Async post request 2. Now we're going to piece together a post request using async and await. Feel free to refer to the async await diagram below at any point while completing this exercise. Async await post diagram. Instructions. 1. At the top of main.js, create an async arrow function and save it to a const getData. The async keyword will ensure that the function returns a promise. Okay, so an async arrow function, const getData, points to async here, and then where we'd pass in everything, and the arrow, and we'll open it up. Let's run that. 2. In the code block for getData, we should add a try statement with an empty code block. That's the first thing we'll do. Try empty code block. In case things go wrong, we need some code to handle that. Below the try code block, add a catch statement and pass in error as an argument. Okay, catch error. Then in the catch statement code block, log error to the console. Console.log error. And let's run that. Number 3. We now have to consider what we want to do inside of the try code block. Since we are making a post request, we should start by using the await keyword before calling the fetch function. We will have to save the returned promise in a variable called response using the const keyword. Let's do that. Const response equals await fetch. And I think that is it. There's nothing to put inside the fetch yet. So yeah, let's run that. Number 4. In the fetch call we just made, pass the following URL to the function as a string for the first argument. Then, as our second argument, let's pass in an empty object for now. Okay, let's take this as a string. And run that. There's our string, there's our empty object. Let's get to number 5. Let's now fill in the request options in our second argument. First, add the method property, and the value is post. Okay, let's do that first. So right in here, method post. Then we have to include a body property, and the value is json.stringify. Okay, so let's do body, and then we'll do our json.stringify with our object. We could paste that right in there. Remember to separate the properties with the comma, which is what I did right here. That's the comma separating the properties. Let's run that. Oh, I did it completely wrong. Post as a capital and a string. Okay, run that. Number 6. After the code block of response, we should create an if statement that checks the OK property of the response object. Okay. If response.OK, and that's its block. Inside the code block of the conditional statement, await the resolution of calling the .json method on response. Save the returned object to a variable called JSON response using the keyword const. Const JSON response is going to equal await, and it'll be response.json invoked. Let's run that. Great. Number 7. Now that we have what we want, we should return JSON response directly below the code written in the previous step. Okay, let's do that directly below the code in the previous step. So right here, return JSON response. Like with previous boilerplate exercises, we're practicing writing code. Normally, we would want to do more beyond this step of returning JSON response. Let's run that. That worked. Number 8. Below the if conditional, throw a new error with the message request failed. Okay. Below the if. So right here, throw new error request failed exclamation point, and run that. Nice work. Didn't that feel very similar to making a GET request? Yes, it did. Next. Async post request 3. Since you've created the boilerplate code for a post request, the next step is to incorporate that experience and logic into making a real request. In this exercise, you'll need to retrieve your rebrandly API key to access the rebrandly API keys. If you reset the exercise at any point, you will have to paste in your API key again at the top. I'm going to grab my key again, I'll copy it and paste it in at the top here. So where it says your API key, get rid of that, paste in your API key. And that's actually the first instruction. At the top of main.js, assign API key to your rebrandly API key. We could run that. Number 2. Under the comment Ajax functions, create a new arrow function and assign it to a const shorten URL using the async keyword. So under the Ajax function code goes here, we'll make a const shorten URL, and it's a fat arrow function, and it needs to be async, so we will say async before the arguments, and run that. Number 3. Inside the code block of the arrow function of shorten URL, create 2 consts. One named URL to shorten, and assign it input field .value. Let's do that first. Const URL to shorten equals input field .value. The other is named data, and assign it the value of calling json.stringify and passing in an object destination URL to shorten. So a const called data that equals json.stringify, and inside of there I'm going to paste in this object and run that. Please note, we will be working inside shorten URL for the remainder of this exercise. Number 4. Add a try statement and leave the code block empty for now. After the try code block, create a catch statement and pass in error. In the code block of catch error, log error to the console. So we need to do a try catch in shorten URL. After we made these const, we will try, and there's our code block, and we will catch an error, and they want us to log it to the console, so console.log that error. Let's run that. Great. Number 5. Inside the try block using const, create a variable named response and assign it to await the value of calling fetch. Okay. So in try const response equals await fetch. We'll run that. Number 6. In the fetch call, pass in URL as the first argument and an empty object as the second argument. In that empty object you just created, it will have the following 3 properties: method with a value of post, body with a value of data, headers with a value of the object below. And we can see that object here, it has a content type of application JSON and API key of API key. Okay, so in our fetch over here, let's add in that URL, and then we will comma, get this object ready, open it up. Method was a string of post. Then we will comma to the next thing, which is body, with a value of data, which we made right above this. And finally, headers. And that's this entire object, which I'm just going to copy in. There we go. And let's run that. Oh, I keep on doing this with post. Post has to be all capital. There we go. Number 7. Below the variable response from the previous step, create a conditional statement that checks if the OK property of response evaluates to a truthy value. Okay, so below response, after we make this entire call, which starts with this fetch and then it ends here, so right around here, well, we're still in the try block. Yes, we are. Great. This isn't really pretty the way they have this going because of how little of the page it takes up, so I'm sorry if this is a little ugly. But we need to make a statement if response.ok, and that's it. So let's run that. Number 8. Inside the code block of the conditional statement, await response.json and save it to a variable called JSON response using the const keyword. All right, so if response OK, const JSON response will equal response.json invoked. And let's run that. Const JSON response. What did I spell wrong? Equals response.json. Oh, didn't await it again. Await. That's something definitely to remember. When you do this response.json, you need to await that. This is an asynchronous bit of code here. So you'll get nothing back. You'll just get a promise back if you don't await it, and that's why that turned out red there. Number 9. Call the function renderRawResponse and pass in a JSON response, then run the code. Okay, let's call that function. That'll be after that. And we want to pass in JSON response and run the code. In the response field, you can paste in a URL and click the shorten button. I'll take this one, paste it in, click shorten, and we can see that object that we've seen several times. You should now see an object containing all the information the rebrandly API sent back. You can view the purpose of the renderRawResponse helper function at public/helper functions. Number 10. Now it's time to clean up the response sent back. Delete renderRawResponse taking in JSON response and replace it with renderResponse taking in JSON response. Run the code, then paste your URL and click the shorten button. Okay, so we need to put that in here. Now it's just renderResponse. We need to run our code, and then we could put the URL in again. So here we go. Paste it in and shorten. And you can see it looks a lot better now, and we're just getting the URL back without any more of the data that was sent back from the API. Notice the formatted response. Great job using rebrandly to shorten your URL. You can view the purpose of the renderRawResponse helper function at public/helper functions. And let's go to the next lesson. Review request 2. Let's recap on the concepts covered in the previous exercises. 1. Get and post requests can be created a variety of ways. 2. Use AJAX to asynchronously request data from APIs. Fetch and async await are new functionalities developed in ES6, promises, and ES8, respectively. 3. Promises are a new type of JavaScript object that represents data that will eventually be returned from a request. 4. Fetch is a web API that can be used to create requests. Fetch will return promises. 5. We can chain .then methods to handle promises returned by fetch. 6. The .json method converts a returned promise to a JSON object. 7. Async is a keyword that is used to create functions that will return promises. 8. Await is a keyword that is used to tell a program to continue moving through the message queue while a promise resolves. 9. Await can only be used within functions declared with async. Instructions. Congratulations on learning all about AJAX request using fetch, async, and await. These concepts are fundamental and will help you develop more robust web apps. Play around with browser and code to make get and post requests. If you're going to make post request, make sure you assign API key your rebrandly API key and run the code. If you want to challenge yourself, rewrite the request from scratch. Replace the helper methods with your own code. Use different APIs to make get/post requests using async await. And that should do it for us. We'll see what it says is up next. And what it says is up next is congrats. We completed the course. For everyone who went through the entire course, you are a rare breed and you know a lot about JavaScript right now. Please check out my other videos, subscribe, like the videos, and come back for more content as I usually cover more advanced topics and real-world applications. You could code along with me to make some real-world applications now right on YouTube. Great job on this, and I can't wait to see you on the next video. Have a good one.